Okay, welcome to the Media Investment in a Recession, Performance, Transparency or Both. Thanks for joining us, and today we're going to have that conversation. But before we do, let's look at some housekeeping. First of all, again, thanks for joining us. We're planning to finish this not at 1:30, there's a mistake, Darren. We're going to finish at 2 p.m. today. Australian Eastern Standard Time, so 1 hour exactly. You can ask a question at any time. So please use the Q&A function. We're recording this for future use, and also we'll be asking you to participate in some polls so we can get a sense of how you're currently feeling about this topic. All right, so let me introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Anton Buchner, who is Senior Performance Consultant at Trinity P3. Welcome, Anton.
Hi, Darren.
And Stephen Wright, the Global Media Lead at Trinity P3. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
All right. Now, look, this is a hot topic because since 2015, when the ANA released the K2 report into media agencies, there's been a lot of focus, especially in the trade media, around achieving media transparency. But look, we have to admit, in the face of a coming global recession brought on by this COVID-19 pandemic, do we think marketers will need to transition away from transparency to focus more on performance? Or will they need to continue focusing on transparency? And in fact, what role does both play, and can it be achieved? So that's what we're going to discuss today. I think before we get started though, let's see how you're feeling about which one's more important. So I'm going to launch the poll now. And if you can participate by giving us your view on what's more important for advertisers when it comes to their media investment. Is it achieving complete transparency, measurable and accountable performance, or both transparency and performance? Please give us your opinion. Okay, we're getting some good feedback here. All right. So there we go. Now I'm going to share those results. So, in actual fact, 8 out of 10 people have said that both transparency and performance are more important. 2 out of 10 have said measurable and accountable, whereas no one is backing you, Stephen, on achieving transparency. So you've got a hard road here.
Well, look, I didn't necessarily think that transparency was the only thing that was important, but it certainly is important. And I think maybe just to go back into a little bit of history, I mean, transparency was never an issue. Pre-digital, there was a system of accreditation and standard commissions that meant pretty much everyone knew exactly what everyone else was getting and everyone was paying. And then digital came in, and at the same time, accreditation was being dismantled. And all of a sudden, things became a bit blurred. You know, 10% suddenly became 15% for some digital, 20%, even beyond that for some areas of digital. And so, you know, that blurred things. And then when programmatic came in, there was this whole new layer that blurred things even further, because in between buyer and seller, as well as that commission structure, you now had technologies, the technology fees, and a whole auction process that demanded payments that was incredibly opaque. So, you know, suddenly transparency was an issue, and a major issue.
Well, Stephen, I'll just challenge you on that, because, you know, you have to remember the K2 report was talking about kickbacks to agencies. And I think anyone that's worked in media for more than 10 years would know that kickbacks go back a long way. I mean, well before digital. You know, so I understand what you mean with transparency in the supply chain, but what about the idea of media, you know, rebates, kickbacks, money being paid through beyond the commission system?
Well, there were rumours of them existing in some way, shape or form. But with the breakdown of accreditation and the lack of understanding around digital, and the new digital players and suppliers who came on board, all of a sudden there were a whole combination of elements that sort of broke it down. And even the players that had been very much sort of standard and operated on the commission system previously started to having to operate and provide greater incentives. So once the system started to break down, the whole marketplace started to move towards a far more fluid level of commission. And, you know, to try and hide it, commissions became incentives, all sorts of terminology around it. Started to come into play, and the way in which agencies could receive extra remuneration.
So just to summarise, you're saying that it was always there, but it's got worse since the advent and the large volumes of money going into the digital supply chain.
It was a perfect storm of factors that came together that meant suddenly the whole thing sort of grew exponentially in a short period of time. And at the same time, particularly in the area of digital and programmatic, became incredibly opaque with that middle component of tech fees, tech supplier charges, which was incredibly poorly understood by marketers and most advertising and media people. You know, when it first came in, there were very few.
Sorry, Stephen, but it was also a decade when marketing procurement was putting a lot of pressure on media agencies over fees as well, weren't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, advertisers have their part to play in why all of this happened. Procurement departments became far more involved in media pitches, agency reviews, and the one thing they understand is price. Media's been a dark art for them and still is. So they default to looking at price, and there was an enormous amount of pressure on transparent commissions at exactly the time when the opportunity to gain extra commissions was introduced through programmatic. So those two factors in combination meant that agencies looked to compete by taking greater margins in the area of digital and programmatic, because it was more hidden from the client and then be more competitive on the transparent terms. So having said that, when this whole thing sort of came up and the K2 report came out, I think there are a lot of marketers that were very shocked and surprised by, you know, what became evident of what was happening. I mean, P&G, one of the world's largest and most sophisticated advertisers, had no idea until that point in time that they had no visibility and they had no control and they had no knowledge of the margins being taken. So, you know, it became a major issue really sort of overnight. And, you know, and a lot of marketers had to address it or had to consider it. I think what happened from there was, first of all, the agencies came out and defended quite aggressively initially. And a lot of marketers were then left with this dilemma. You know, a number of them lifted up the bonnet, looked under the hood, and, you know, it was a very confusing scenario. And no one was offering any ready solutions. You know, there was no capacity to get transparency other than to directly challenge your agency. So I think, you know, there was a surprising level of inaction immediately after the report came out, because there was nothing that marketers could readily do to solve the issue. And one of the other things that happened was, and in fact, one of the marketers admitted this over a few beers one night. He said, look, I don't know what to do, because the first thing I have to do is own a problem. So I have to own a problem, which to my CFO and my CEO are the fact that I've been paying far more than I should for my digital and my programmatic activity. And he said, you know, whilst the largest advertisers in the world, like P&G, may have been in the same scenario, as far as he's concerned, his view might be that I've been asleep at the wheel. You know, this was on my watch. So he said, the first thing I've got to do is own a problem. And then there's no ready solution. And do I get credit for solving a problem that was of my own making, in his view. So it was really difficult for marketers because there was no solution in sight.
Yeah. So, Anton, you just heard Stephen saying that this whole transparency issue has been exacerbated by the digital supply chain. And yet I'm sure as what used to be called a direct marketer, digital was like manna from heaven because it was going to be so measurable and accountable and performance focused. You know, what went wrong as far as digital if we're talking about transparency and not performance?
Yeah, look, I agree with Steve. That was the exciting part when it first started. You'd move, I guess, eyeballs onto this whole digital platform, and everyone got excited and suddenly thought, oh, we can click on things. You go back, I'm sure everyone remembers the original banner ads. You know, you could click on something and suddenly everyone started clicking on something, went click mad, and everyone started measuring it, going, this is fantastic, I can actually measure. I think I'll pick up on what Steve said was the economics of the whole ecosystem. It's been a major problem on one side, and then the complexity that Steve talked about has just exacerbated it. That economic model, if you think of publishing, you know, the good old days, it was linear. You had magazines, you published, went out. You had newspapers, you published, advertised, went out. We then went through this era of building advertising models that were sort of all over the place and allowed you to get ads out, but still in a fairly linear fashion. And then, of course, we had the whole change to audiences going to platforms. So we suddenly moved into social media world, the Facebooks and the Googles, who sort of, dare I say it, stole the audiences away from publishers. And Steve and I often talk about, that's that race to the bottom. So free space, free media, free social media, freemium models are a race to the bottom. So we started having advertisers and people going, okay, what's the place to be? We've got to be in this platform. So they had the power, took the power away from the publishers. And there wasn't really a desire to talk to each other, was there? The Facebooks and Googles of the world ran their own race. We know what's happened with Facebook in terms of transparency and fake news. And suddenly that's going, okay, well, Zuckerberg comes out and says we'll move away from ads and news, and with fake news, we'll move towards people and friends, and that'll be the guide as to what space to watch. So the algorithm changes. So I think as we've seen all these progressions, there haven't been standards. You've had to then monetize platforms. So we've had the whole paywall era come in. So where do we make money, I guess, is ultimately the issue here, isn't it? And Steve was touching on that the economics behind all these models, where's money being made? And if we're talking about just performance, it's an advertiser wanting to get a result. That's ultimately what should be measured. But then what's the result? So
but isn't one of the problems that the digital platforms and programmatic is not necessarily being used to drive performance in a direct response way? A lot of it now is, you know, we're having conversations with advertisers talking about, you know, number of impressions, cost per 1,000 impressions, which is a traditional media model that is not necessarily directly performance related, or is it?
Well, it depends how you define performance. And I probably should have opened up with that, because we talk to agencies, media agencies on one hand, creative agencies, and then of course the client marketers. Everyone has a different definition. Performance can be, how did you spend your money? Was it well spent? You know, which was the traditional volume game you're talking about. Did you get the right impressions, or did you get in front of the right audiences? That is one definition of performance. I tend to look at that as the starting baseline. The second part is, how did it perform? Did you get, which ultimately what any marketer wants, did you get a result? Whether that's, you know, click to go somewhere and get a lead, or click to go somewhere and buy online, or get information and go offline and go in a store or go somewhere else, or buy on mobile or whatever it is. But yeah, I think you do need to look at both sides of the definition of performance, a volume and value sell, a volume sell, and how did I get my ads out there and who did I get them to? But really, that performance is back to your objective. You know, what are you trying to do?
Yeah. So you'd say you need to have a broader view of performance beyond just a direct return on investment, and look at it in a much broader sense.
Yeah, and I think I'm a pretty simple man. You've got a product and a service, and you want to get it to people. So when you start thinking like that, you pare back from all this technology and this very confusing ecosystem, which, as Steve alluded to, on the demand side or the supply side, we've got data platforms, exchanges, bidding, auctions, etc. The ad tech is for most people probably listening a bit of a nightmare, but yeah, it's navigating through that.
So, Steve, with all these changes and this complexity, what does transparency? Because Anton's just given us a definition of performance. What's your view of what transparency means today in, say, the digital space?
Yeah, look, what the recent ISBA PwC report, which focused on programmatic, which is where transparency is the biggest issue, had a 15% black hole that PwC, with some of the most expensive accountants in the world, could not track down and work out where that 15% of funds went. Now that's 15% of the 49% that was missing. So it's actually 30% of the amount that was lost between advertiser and publisher. 30%, that's an incredibly large amount. Now, up until recently, our advice at Trinity B3 is you can't find out what's happening there. So don't worry about that. Focus on performance and what works for you, because you can run around in circles trying to get transparency of that middle component. You can have the tightest contracts in the world with auditing rights that are absolutely comprehensive, but you're still not going to be able to find out what's going on, because everything happens in a fraction of a second. And the only way in which you can work out what's happening is by attaching technologies that can work out what happens in that sort of middle ground with all those tech suppliers. Now, up until recently, there hasn't been a solution. But I mean, the good news, the great news is that there are now, well, there's at least one platform that is fully operational and up and running and can now provide transparency across what's happening in the middle of that supply chain. And I mean, what's interesting is, I mean, it's good news for media agencies, because this is actually taking the emphasis of them as being the guilty party with regard to transparency. They were really tarred with the transparency brush far more than the ad tech providers in the middle. They were the ones that received all the flack. They were seen as the main culprits in what was perceived as something that was, overcharging. But, agencies have largely cleaned up their act. Those that owned tech companies in the middle have divested their interests. And what exists now is this 15% that ISBA and PwC identified is all funds that are in that middle compart with ad tech providers. Now, the new systems show exactly where all those funds are going. And it's incredible, because there are sometimes as many as 20 ad tech companies that are touching the programmatic buy on the way through, many of whom are adding limited or questionable value, but all of whom are adding cost. So the new technologies, which are built on blockchain technology, are able to work out the most direct routes between advertiser and publisher, which can benefit publisher and can benefit advertiser, because less money is lost. That's working more for the advertiser, and the publisher's receiving more. And the results that these technologies have shown are quite remarkable, up to 30% in terms of saving across the middle. It means that technology companies have kind of been put on notice a bit. They need to justify and substantiate their role in the process, because visibility means that they are being tracked and measured. So it's great news. It's great news for advertisers, and it's great news for publishers as well.
Isn't it a little ironic, Stephen, that it takes technology to actually solve the problem created by technology? So what you're saying then is that increasingly, especially in the programmatic space, there is now opportunities to achieve the types of transparency people have been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the parameters of price, viewability, and engagement, and then you can look at those for across each individual buyer by date, by time of day, by day of week, by geo, and you've got absolute transparency across every buy that can be put together and aggregated. So it's the perfect tool. If you're talking about transparency for targeting, it's a perfect tool to provide that. So yes, it's been sold by technology providers, but yes, it was created by them as well. But it probably hasn't been possible until now because it does rely on technologies, blockchain technology, which really hasn't been at a level to deliver this until now.
Finally, we've heard something that blockchain can do. Yay!
It's not just talk anymore.
Yeah. So, Anton, because often we've seen many, especially performance marketers, refer to last click attribution because it's very difficult to get any sort of data around what's influenced that last click. But people talk about attribution models beyond the last click. Is that an opportunity for a performance marketer?
Yeah, I'd love people to maybe drop a comment on this. A hands up, an honest hands up. Has anyone seen an attribution model that has actually worked beyond a last click in a pure play environment? I'd be interested to see if anyone puts the hand up.
Use the hands up function to indicate that if you want to.
Yeah, I think just
comment on the Q&A.
Sorry, mate. Just quickly on the technology, solving technology that Steve talked about before I jump back to the attribution. Therein lies, I think, a massive dilemma in all of this. That how do you understand the technology? And we've seen, especially with programmatic, do people understand how the bidding is happening? And obviously, there's been changes in bidding over time. How algorithms are working, or is it just a black box and trust the media agency or trust the trading desk, etc. So I think that in itself, in just understanding technology, understanding the bidding process, header bidding was a whole new era, a couple of years ago, which drove value up so that the price of bidding could go up as opposed to race to the bottom of lowest cost to serve ads. So it's not as easy to talk about performance in just we advertise and we measure and it's done. And if I bring that back to then attribution modeling, it sounded like nirvana, didn't it? It sounded like, oh, well, we can use attribution models to say, let's look at all these different channels. Let's see how they went. Well, the last click was easy. And we just did that off the last ad or the last video or the last AdWord that I clicked on, whatever it was. And everyone thought, well, that's pretty easy. But the logic was totally flawed because, as you know, we've seen something out of home, we've seen a radio ad, heard a radio ad, we've seen a print ad, whatever. We know totally multi-channel. And then within the digital environment, a massive journey to end up clicking on an ad. But it was the easiest way to do it, last click. Then people went to first click and said, well, let's attribute everything to the first click. Remember, Steve? And everyone got very excited saying, oh, well, the first click was the one that sparked the whole idea. So that must be the one that should get all the allocation. Then people said, well,
sorry, Anton, we've had a comment. David said that he's seen quite a few models, for multi-touch attribution at work in agencies. Extremely hard to prove accuracy of contribution at each stage of the funnel. And in fact, there's been a couple of really good examples of attribution, especially between, for instance, television and then leads onto websites, where they've used time periods for attributing those leads to a particular television spot.
Yeah, that's the classic one, from TV to potentially e-com as well, mobile to e-com. We can do it very much in a day part or a time part. You can pick regions as well. But yeah, there's so many different attribution models. There is completely linear. Let's just give 20% across the board. We don't know. We've got 5 channels. We give 20% to each of them and just do it that way.
Doesn't sound like a model.
And then there's the weighted model. Well, we just weighted a little bit closer towards the sale because I must be warming people up with each additional channel, and therefore the most important ones are the closer to sale. I don't know, if you think about what you bought recently, I bought books online. How did I find out about them? Through a friend who posted something on Facebook. I read that. I went to Google a review. Oops, search engine. I then happened to click on something else after the review. Then I came back about half an hour later, and I ended up buying the book through Amazon Australia. If you're going to follow my journey and attribute that sale to the last ad I saw, or the article I saw, or the news piece I saw, or the friends piece that I saw in Facebook, it's very complex, isn't it?
Mm.
These models, look, I'm around for the 90s, as you said, direct marketing land. It's when CRM was going to solve everything. Customer relationship management. We could measure everything. I think this attribution model was another one of those. It's going to solve everything. We know we're in a multi-channel world, so we'll work out an attribution model. A lot of them are flawed. I'm going to put it out there. Steve, feel free to disagree. 98% that I come across and see are pretty much flawed, either through logic. It doesn't flow in the actual user journey logically. Every user is different, so to weight, a general weighted average on things is then just an average. I'd like to say it can give you a trend.
Attribution has always been flawed. When people used to be surveyed, they'd always say, I found about it from television. Often when there wasn't even a television ad for a campaign, there was so it's been flawed. It's always been flawed in terms of, the effect of media, and nothing's changed. It's just got more complex. But I think you need to look at those results and as David points out, be really cautious about reading too much into them, because they may give interesting steers, but you should never rely on them definitively.
Where I've seen it work is when you're a completely walled environment. So that ends up, what I would say, is one channel. And that's not really. But so Facebook itself, as a company, Facebook can do a really good attribution model because they're within their garden. But of course, they've started to advertise outside their garden, and that adds all sorts of complexity. So, Steve, I agree. Be careful.
Yeah, Irene also adds in that attribution in measuring the success of outdoor, like transit and billboards. It's interesting because with the increased use of digital outdoor, we're still not seeing a lot where it's being set up as an attribution model. It's largely still awareness or a information media.
Yeah.
The ones that have worked is a lead off the billboard, where they are doing, text in a number or go straight away to potentially URL.
So direct response.
Yeah, and you can get a read a little bit on that lead. But again, what did I see leading up to seeing the billboard? So it's big question marks for me.
So all we need now is QR codes to come back, and people will be driving along trying to scan the billboard as they direct response. Over to you, Steve. One of the consequences of this incredible focus on trying to achieve transparency is, one of them is that advertisers are inclined to not put their investment into channels that could perform for them quite well, like programmatic, because they perceive that there's a risk associated with it because of a perceived lack of transparency. But the other is, we've seen some major advertisers taking more and more of their media planning and buying in-house because they believe that will actually deliver transparency to them by simply taking the media agency out of the equation. Now, I know from personal experience that almost every case they're still working with agencies, so no one's managed to take it completely in-house. But what's your read on this?
There's two things. First of all, programmatic has a smaller share of digital here than in the UK or the US. It has been held back a little because there has been this uncertainty around it. And the second thing I'd say is that, the taking things in-house was a function of really a pushback against agencies and this perception that they were taking this massive amount of money away. And, there was some foundation in that. The margins were very high for some people on some pieces of business, and agencies were taking perhaps more than they should have. But I don't think the level of savings was anywhere near as realised as some people thought it might be. And in Australia, there are very few clients who have the scale to take things in-house and make them work. And there are a lot of issues with running sort of digital and programmatic in-house. I mean, it's incredibly hard to keep up to date with the technologies, very hard to staff. I mean, you're talking about, programmatic experts are largely millennials who do tend to move around a fair bit and don't necessarily want to work in an advertiser in-house environment. So those advertisers that have taken in-house have seen a lot of problems without necessarily getting as many savings as they initially envisaged. But, for them, there is a solution in sight, because if they now are able to use the new technologies, then they and advertisers and agencies and everyone in the middle has the capacity to get that visibility across the 15% black zone identified by PwC and ISBA. So
you're saying that achieving transparency is still an important objective, because it will actually help achieve, a better, a more open understanding of the media ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, really, you will optimize your performance based on what you have visibility of. So you will optimize without transparency across what's happening, particularly in the area of programmatic. You will optimize around that to everything that you can see. But the capacity for you to speculate on what's working and what isn't in that middle black zone in a complex area such as programmatic is nigh impossible. You can't speculate because of the tremendous number of variables and people at play. So I would say what everyone has done till now, advertisers direct and advertisers through their agencies, is optimize based on what they can see. Yeah. But now they will have the capacity to optimize with full visibility across that programmatic area. And that inevitably will mean you can improve performance. And as has been demonstrated by the early adopters of this technology, who have seen sort of 30% improvements in their performance, because they can make all those savings in the path between advertiser and publisher with that information and knowledge.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Anton, one of the big issues we have when we start talking to marketers around performance and how they measure performance is especially those that don't have a in quotes, direct response type sales or distribution channel, often struggle with having the data to be able to measure performance. Do you have any advice, or why do you think that is? Because you would think in a business you would want to have very clear ideas of where your business is coming from.
Yeah, well, it's the great question we've always had. Half my budget's working, half isn't. Which half? Digital has made that even worse. I tend to talk about you don't know where 75% of your budget's going and how effective that is. Picking up on Steve's point, you can lift the hood on everything and suddenly through this whole chain understand the technologies. I think that had to happen. I think it was a Wild West era for a long time. The agencies have admitted it. That lots of things were covered up and things were happening behind the scenes. That's as a new industry was being born. This transparency debate, I think, is a good one in the sense of getting people to understand at least this whole end-to-end system or flow. But even then, if the millennials are driving a lot of the activity, if you come back to performance, you go, what are you actually measuring? And what does the business really want to know? And we're talking about business metrics. We're talking about sales metrics. We're talking about brand and brand affinity metrics. So I always talk about it is bloody hard to measure. When we do look at it on behalf of clients or with agencies, we're stepping back, I guess, from a first point of call and going, what are you trying to do? Then you're looking at where money is actually spent. And I always ask, do you understand where that's being spent? And I think that's picking up what Steve said, that gets the transparency and understanding of knowledge to go, do we just rely on the agency to be doing this? Do we rely on the ad exchanges to be doing that? So you got to know a fair bit in this on the supply side or demand side. And that's just the ad tech. So that's a difficulty area just in ad tech. Yes, Steve?
Anton, I think one of the things out of all this is if suddenly you have full transparency and the capacity to optimize performance from the advertising and the supply chain, the onus comes back onto advertisers and marketers to have high quality data and the capacity to understand their customers. And I think at the moment, again, in Australia, we perhaps lag behind some of the other major markets. There's a lot of quite significant advertisers out there who haven't got high quality data available, who haven't got the data aligned internally within their organization across customers, sales and marketing. So everyone is talking to a high quality unified single data source. And that is, once you have transparency and you can optimize performance with complete transparency on the supply chain side, that becomes the issue with regard to making that work for the brand and the product. And, I think there's quite a high level of investment that a lot of companies haven't yet made in getting their own data to a high quality. And there's very few advertisers who have or manage their own DMP or are active in the management of it through their agency. And I think that's an area where there's the great potential for improved performance.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was going to call that all the MarTech. So you got all the ad tech, let alone the MarTech, all the customer view. I mean, I remember there was a classic where I'd purchased a product and then I was targeted with an ad 3 days after. It was in the airlines industry. I'd actually gone and then I was targeted with an offer. So if I think like that, the ad assessment would have been, I've been served it, so it's a good quality serve. Did I click on that ad? Yes or no? So I'm sort of starting to analyze data in these silos, I guess, Steve, as he said, without the full view. So one of my big worries in all of this, to measure performance, you're still looking at quite narrow bands, and it isn't a true view. So you've got then media just looking at the media performance, but you and I and all the people listening hopefully would agree that you can't look just at the media perspective. It's got to be much broader.
Well, there's a lot of advertisers who still translate raw demographic audiences into the digital and programmatic marketplace, and they're kind of missing a trick going in with things that are quite blunt, bold, and based on a lot of historic assumptions. So, that's as big an opportunity as supply chain transparency in a way.
Yeah, and that could be dangerous. I think where I've seen it really work well is, and this is the age-old test and learn, you really have to get into systematically testing, which, if you start talking about premium inventory, or I can track something through to at least a lead or a sale of some level, then you can start systematically testing platforms you're on, sites you're on. You can start sifting out inventory that's rubbish or junk. You can start pulling out fraud and some level of fraud and bots, which is a great big unknown in all of this as well. And you really start to focus on areas that are working. But that's really, really nitty gritty and often really, really hard to do, and needs to be set up in tests in isolation. So my worry in performance and talking only performance is you're setting yourself up for failure, because I'm talking myself out of performance here, because you end up going...
You're arguing against yourself.
I often do that because I know Steve was going to say it, so I better get in early. But yeah, I mean, performance is only as good as the data you're looking at, and often the data is shit, excuse my French, because it's not giving you that true picture, or it's very skewed. So it's dangerous then to look at performance and back to the attribution models, what's actually working. So, of
course, one of the issues that we haven't touched on is the cookieless world, because there's been a heavy reliance on using cookies as a way of tracking people and their behaviours. And so, everyone's saying that once that disappears, it's going to be incredibly difficult unless you have terrific first-party data that allows you to then actually, find your audiences.
Yeah, well, I think the government's doing that around the world, aren't they, with these lovely apps that we're now all downloading. So, dare I say, the COVID-19 apps, which I hope everyone has downloaded. can geolocate anybody within a pinpoint. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, well, if they can get it to work on my iPhone, yeah.
But yeah, cookieless world, that's a massive issue. And therein lies, what I'm saying, that the dilemma of who can you track, how can you track? Are you tracking it by mobile, location, your location serving? Is that location exact? First-party data. It's interesting, actually, Darren, isn't it? Because we've gone from the world of direct mail lists. So the 60s, 70s, 80s of direct mail lists where I clearly had the list, the name, whether that's a prospect or a customer. And I think we're actually coming full circle, that the clients and customers that are gathering their own databases, whether that's a big prospect universe or their actual first-party customer data, there's the power, because we're not trusting the big platforms, are we? We're not trusting the FBs of the world and Google's question mark on their algorithms. So I think we're coming back to saying we can control what we can control. So let's rebuild our first-party databases, but use that in media much more intelligently and much better. And then I can track it hopefully through.
And of course, this is where the cloud-based CRMs are going to be, have an advantage, because they're collecting so much of this personal data within their system. It's the privacy laws that stop them actually commoditizing it or commercializing it.
Yeah, but then we're going to drown in data again, which is the age-old debate if we just have way too much data and too many people looking at their own little silos. So I think the warning for marketers out there, I'd say just two quick things about performance. Understand it. So get your knowledge and understanding up, whether that's the agency coming in and really lifting the hood up and explaining it. I ask plenty of dumb questions. Steve does too. But asking those silly questions that really get your knowledge up, that's got to be first and foremost. And then look at it from a data perspective. What are you actually capturing? What are you looking at? What are you trying to interpret here? And if you keep that as simple as possible and don't fall into this complexity world, because it's bloody complex, then I think you're setting yourself up for at least some level of trend or some level of tracking.
Okay. Look, I'm going to ask everyone, if you have any questions now that you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer those questions. While you're thinking about that, I've got a question for both of you. Which do you think is harder to achieve, transparency or performance? And I don't mean just transparency that's nice to have, but do you think we'll ever get to complete transparency? And do you ever think we'll get to accountable performance?
Do you want to go first, Anton? Go on.
I'll jump in. Do I think we'll get to complete transparency? No. We'll never get to complete transparency, just like we'll never get rid of the COVID virus, completely eradicate it to zero. Why do I say that? I think we're trending towards this whole robot world, so AI, blockchain, as we alluded to. The more we're going to rely on all this automation, it's a confusing world. There are no standards. So I think you're setting yourself up for failure to say, let's get completely transparent in all of this, because we don't understand often how the algorithm was written. We don't know how it's bidding necessarily. We don't know whether it's actually the right bidding we want to do for our brand. We can pay a price, and price focused is one thing, but I don't really want to look at cost. I want to look at value and performance, whether that performance is just a value lead or a value sale. So I don't think we're going to get to it. What's more important? Harder to achieve. I'm going to put myself right on the fence here. Steve, I'd love to hear your views. I think they're extremely hard to...
Look, I disagree a little on the transparency on the cost side of things, because I think the new technologies and blockchain, which can measure things in real time, can give you complete transparency on what's happening at every stage. I mean, it's only programmatic where it's really blurred at the moment. And that programmatic area will be solved by blockchain technology. There are systems being investigated, and these might be a few years away, that are looking to take every single buy and have this universal blockchain technology attached to everything. And that will be full, complete transparency for everyone on everything in the marketplace.
You'll trust that?
It's probably pie in the sky at the moment, because I don't think that even blockchain technology has the capacity to do that now. But there are technologies that individual advertisers can take up that will give them visibility for themselves across the marketplace. And even that takes an incredible amount of capacity to store and manage data. But blockchain technology can do that now.
What's that? I'm going to counter your counter. Look what happened with the, dare I say it as an example, the Donald, what was his first relaunched event where the TikTok kids corrupted the number of...
Tulsa.
Yeah.
where they had 1 million inquiries for tickets.
Couldn't possibly
1,000-person stage.
Yeah,
6,000.
Maybe that was a made-up number too. But the transparency, whether a human can interrupt the process, and therefore I don't think you're getting great transparency. So I guess I'm broadening.
Okay, yeah. I was talking transparency for the advertiser from cost. You were talking about transparency in terms of consumer actions.
Yeah.
Then no, you can never have that, as it was abused, obviously, in that case, to undermine Mr. Trump in the US.
And I think,
we've got two great questions here.
Right.
First one's from David. One of the biggest transparency challenges we haven't touched on is ad fraud. And its existence, its scale, and the claims agencies make about being able to eradicate it. In your opinion, who's winning the ad fraud war? The fraud industry or those trying to prevent it?
Ooh, there's a curly question. Look, I'll talk briefly first, and Anton, you're probably a little more expert in this area. So, I think the level of fraud is almost certainly understated. I think it's very much in the interest of the industry to understate it, not to panic people away from it as a medium. The extent to which it's understated, I'm not sure. But one of the telling things is that a lot of the companies that are set up to detect fraud are kind of owned by a lot of the companies whose interests are in keeping the level of reported fraud to a minimum. So I think it is an issue. I don't think it's as much of an issue as it used to be, but I think it's an issue, and it's more of an issue than perhaps some of the official numbers state. Anton, what's your view? You're the expert really in this area.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I think it's grossly understated. I was going to say that the ad fraud industry is winning. Winning in a sense that, a bit like that transparency, I don't think we can ever get it down to a zero or eradicate it. It's going to be around, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is the technology itself, that the fraudsters are always inventing new ways of creating the fraud, and that the industry is always playing catch up. Yeah. So it's going to be one of those things that'll go on. But if only we had more transparency into the real size, because while we keep saying, oh, we've got it under control as an industry, it's actually allowing the fraudsters a free rein to be innovating and maximising their yield. I've got another question here for you guys. How can you ensure the performance results provided by the agency's post-campaigns are actually accurate and a true result? Stephen?
Very good question. Well, I think you have to rely on your agency to provide you with accurate and honest details, and I would say the vast majority of agencies do. I think what they probably don't do is give you an idea of how much better your performance might have been. I mean, my advice to you, if you have any sort of programmatic activity, is to set up very regular dialogue with your agencies to optimize the campaigns when they are in progress. Because one of the things that I have seen is that if you have a programmatic campaign and it's not optimized, at least on a weekly basis, the end performance of a 6-week campaign will be significantly poorer than if it's optimized daily. So advice to marketers is set up a regular phone call to talk about what happened this week and what's going to happen next week and how the campaign can be optimized, because you'll end up with 20, 25, 30% better value from that campaign than, because, you know, there are some agencies with some campaigns that do set and forget a little. And if you're one of the advertisers and marketers that wants that weekly phone call, then you'll be one of the ones that ensures that doesn't happen.
I just want to share a discussion with procurement, who asked me, is it normal for the media agency to get 100% of their performance payment? And I said, well, who sets the KPIs? Oh, the agency does. Well, who measures the KPIs? The agency does. And I said, who validates it? And they went, okay, I understand. And that's why, you know, it is appropriate that you do get a third party, an independent third party, to just validate some of this information. This is one for you, Anton. Lack of alignment between procurement teams and marketers can often be the source of poor or outdated performance metrics being enforced, which in itself prevents agency objectivity and transparency. Can procurement teams be better educated or aligned? And if so, any thoughts on best practice?
Certainly be better aligned. Yes, would be my answer to that one. Well, I think, were they talking about metrics or objectives? If I bring back to objectives.
Metrics, performance metrics.
Okay, well, they're based on the objectives. So metric is a KPI. What are you actually measuring? And we typically see that procurement has one set, and marketing has another, sales and the agencies potentially others. So first thing, clarity on objectives, and then clarity on those metrics has to be key. Second point would be understanding it's okay to have different success measures, but you know, what are you looking at? What does marketing want to look at? Well, marketing wants to prove its value and says, I'm putting ads out or advertising, therefore I've got a better ROI to whatever I'm trying to do. Procurement, typically, as we see it, is looking from a cost perspective. Now, in our world, that's dangerous when we're assessing this, because you don't want to just look at cost. As I said earlier, if you're looking at a cost analysis, then potentially it's a race to the bottom if you're just cutting cost. In the ad land, where you've got free social media, free articles, mobile advertising, it's bundled in, you know, added in. So what is the true cost of something? And therefore, what's the true value of something? You need to look at both sides of the equations. But we see some very good procurement departments that are fully aligned now on cost and value equations. And I think that's where marketers are trying to get much better aligned with their agencies, that we spend, and from a cost perspective, are really looking at aligning our value.
Anton, one of the things that I see is very often, because it's harder to establish sort of KPIs and performance metrics, a lot of the bonus systems and KPI performance systems set up have an awfully large emphasis on relationship and those relationship surveys. And, you know, really, they're probably the least important. I mean, if you look at their soft measures, if you look at relationship and soft measures, I would never say to make those more than 25% of any bonus potential. The hard measures, the company's performance sales, and there are often other variables that are at play that aren't necessarily within the capacity of the media agency partner to influence. So keep those at a reasonable level. So I would say make sure that the things the agency can influence and measure are at least 50 or 60% of the overall performance bonus. And then be quite specific about the things that are measurable that you set that bonus against. But make it simple. After all that, make it as simple as possible, because really complex schemes end up causing problems for everyone in terms of measurement.
I think what I got from both of those is that we need to be doing more work with aligning procurement to the objectives of marketing. And in fact, if procurement can do anything, they are particularly good at the analysis to make sure that those objectives become measurable and that they actually, everyone involved is held accountable. Hey, look, we're running out of time, but what I quickly want to do is if we could get everyone to participate in another poll. So we've got 2 questions here. I've just launched that. Who's responsible for delivering media transparency? And this is multiple choice, so you can pick as many options as you like, or all the above, which is the final one. Is it the advertiser, media agency, the ad tech supply chain, or the media seller, or all of the above? And who's responsible delivering media performance? Advertiser, media agency, supply chain, the media seller, or again, all of the above. So if you could give us your feedback on that and let us know. You know, I think it's interesting because often we see that the agency is often given the responsibility for both of these. And yet the poll here is showing that everyone's responsible. Of course, the danger with that is that if everyone's responsible, then no one is, because everyone goes, well, it's someone else's responsibility, isn't it?
And then you turn to governments. You know, is it a government issue or an industry regulation issue? I mean, just look what's happened with, if you think about offline print, regional printing publishing, demise of all those. Who's going to hold communities to account? Is it government? Should there be regulations? So yeah, this will be an interesting poll to see. All of the above, is that coming out as the winner still?
Well, I'll show you in a minute. We're just about to close the poll. Here we go. We've closed it. I'm going to share the results. So as far as who is responsible for delivering media transparency, the big winner is all the above with 89%, but then people are saying media agency, ad tech supply chain, and the media seller. As far as who's responsible for delivering performance, media performance specifically, the media agency is 44%, the media seller 11%, and all of the above is also 44%. So that's our polls, and thank you everyone for participating and giving us your feedback. And also, I'll just do a bit of, we've recorded this, so it'll be available tomorrow. You'll get an email with a link to it. But if you haven't already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to trinityp3.com/subscribe, because that way you'll keep up to date with all of the things that are going on, including future webinars and events. And also, just want to let you know that here's ways that we can be contacted through our Sydney office, Singapore or London office. We're also in Zurich and New York. I just want to thank Stephen Wright. Thanks, Stephen.
Bye, everyone.
Anton Buchner.
See you. Thank you.
And of course, everyone that joined us today. It's been a terrific conversation, and certainly not one that is finished. So thanks very much.